Okay, we're good to go. So good evening, welcome to our TC Talks on Building Complete Communities. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Councilor Chris Moyes. I'm the City Councilor of Toronto Centre, Ward 13. This is the second year of me hosting TC Talks, and we host these panels to bring expert information to you with an opportunity for you to ask questions directly to our special guests. We have a very eventful evening with a lot of to cover. I forgot my glasses at home. And I know you are all just as excited as I am to discuss what building complete communities means from various angles and perspectives. But before we begin, I'd like to start us in a good way. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on sacred land, the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and the Chippewa peoples. Toronto today is home to many diverse people, including Africans who were trafficked during the Atlantic slave trade and their descendants. This land is subject to the District 1 Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which compels everyone to stewardship of the land. We must recognize that we all need to eat and live off the abundance of the land equally. And we recognize the same reality for our future generations. Without intentionality and care, we cannot honor these responsibilities and pay respects to the Indigenous elders and ancestors to show that we understand that we are all treaty people. Our code of conduct. This is a safe and inclusive space. Everyone must be treated with respect and dignity. Discrimination or harassment of any form, whether verbal or physical, would not be tolerated. We believe in fostering an atmosphere that encourages open dialogue and productive conversation. Comments should be constructive, respectful, and related to the discussion at hand. Everyone has the right to privacy. Those who do not wish to be photographed, videotaped, or recorded to request a sticker from the registration desk back of the room. Attendees taking photos, videos, or recordings must obtain the consent of the subject of the photos, videos, or recordings. By following this code of conduct, we can have a productive discussion. And thank you for your cooperation in advance. So the agenda is as follows. We're going to start off with a presentation from the Chief Planner from the City Planning Division of the City of Toronto, followed by a presentation from ERA Architecture about heritage planning, then a presentation about housing advocacy from More Neighbors Toronto, and finally from 880 Cities to set the stage. Our panelists will provide some context from a planning policy lens, heritage planning lens, expansion lens, and an advocacy lens. There will be breakouts. Then we'll break out into panel discussions between our panelists. And finally, we'll facilitate questions period, and we'll wrap up for the evening. So that's the housekeeping parts. So first up is Jason Thorne, the Chief Planner of the City of Toronto. Jason Thorne is the Chief Planner and Executive Director of City Planning at the City of Toronto, where he leads a team of more than 350 urban planning, urban design, heritage, and technical professionals. An accomplished city builder with more than 25 years of private and public professional experience, Jason provides expertise and leadership on policies, plan, and strategies that support building complete communities and promoting a sustainable, healthy, and economically vibrant Toronto. His public sector experience includes 10 years as the General Manager of the Planning and Economic Development Department at the City of Hamilton and previous roles at the Province of Ontario. Jason also has extensive experience working with non-governmental organizations, having started his career working as a community organizer and activist for a variety of not-for-profit environmental organizations, A proud urbanist, Jason's passion is to solve complex urban issues and create great urban places for everyone. That's a lot, Jason. So coming up and show us what you made of.
I will just adjust. Probably the place that might come to mind is like New York City or Los Angeles or Houston. But actually, the last 2 years, the Toronto region was the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States and Canada. The Toronto CMA, so that's the census metropolitan area, so a bit bigger than just the city. It includes some of the areas around the city as well. Grew by about 270,000 people in 2 years. So not only is that the fastest growing, it is the fastest growing by not a small margin. More than 50,000 more people than the next fastest, which is actually the New York City metropolitan area. So that's a lot of growth over the past couple of years. If you go to the next slide, you can see that when you actually look at the physical change happening in the city. So this is the Toronto skyline in 2006. And if you click the button, you'll see if you take the approved and the built development as of today, this is the Toronto skyline as of 2024. So very significant scale of development. There you go. You can toggle a little bit back and forth and see the change. And what you'll notice as well is a lot of the growth, especially the high density growth, is focused in the former city of Toronto and right here in this ward. On to the next slide. The anticipation is that scale of growth is going to continue. One of the indicators of that is there's actually an index that looks at how many cranes are up in the air as an indicator of how much growth and development is happening. That's Toronto on the left. This is over the last 3 years. So the dark blue line being basically right now, how many cranes are in the air, over 100 cranes. Again, if you look at New York City, which you think of as, okay, there's a big high density growing city, it's around 10. So 10 times the number of cranes we see in some of these other big cities. So that growth that we've been experiencing is continuing. This is a place where people want to live. This is a place where people want to invest. My view is that's a very good thing. If you go to the next slide. We track at the city what we call our development pipeline, which is how many housing units do we have either approved, going through approvals, going into construction. So we have a sense of what our development pipeline looks like. And if you trace all of that, we've got 850,000. So nearly 1 million more residential units kind of in that development pipeline. Now, not all of these get built. Sometimes a developer will go to approval and then nothing will happen. Maybe it just sits, maybe it gets sold. So not all of these immediately turn into housing units, but it gives a sense of the scale of activity that's still happening if you look at the approval system in Toronto. Next slide. And what's interesting in Toronto, and this is actually becoming increasingly true of cities across Canada, but Toronto's at the leading edge of this, is starting to look at growth and development as not only being something that happens in some of the places where maybe we're used to it, like towers at a transit station or along some of our major avenues. What we're starting to plan for, and we're starting to see happen as a result of planning for it, is that housing development starting to happen really across the entire city and in many different forms. So for many, many years, what a lot of cities experience in Toronto was no exception, is some tall and some, so planners would sometimes call it tall and sprawl. You got some towers and you got some townhomes and single detached housing, nothing in between. What we're seeing a lot more of now, and we want to see a lot more of in the future, and we've been trying to put in place policies to allow for it, is the middle scale of housing. So the mid-rise, the low-rise, the multiplexes, the sixplexes, the laneway suites, many more housing typologies, and having that happen in many other parts of the city. But just over the last 3-4 years, almost 90% of the city has gone through some sort of rezone. 90% of the properties in the city have been rezoned. That may not mean a lot to the non-planners in the room. As a planner, wow, that is a lot of transformation to happen in a relatively short period of time. Next slide. And it's not just residential. We also have a pipeline for how much what planners call non-residential development is happening. So that might be retail uses, industrial, office uses, institutional things like places of worship, schools, all of those sort of non-residential development that happens in the city. And again, a very significant development pipeline of nearly 14 million square meters of new non-residential development in that development pipeline. So again, that's good news. You wouldn't want to be a city that's only growing with residential, because this is our jobs. This is the stores that we're going to shop in. That's really important stuff to have as well as part of a complete community. So, zeroing in a little bit. So looking at that development pipeline, zooming in a little bit to Toronto Centre, this has been and continues to be one of our fastest growing areas from a residential standpoint. And then if you flip to the next slide, also from a non-residential standpoint. And again, that's a positive thing in terms of bringing on new housing, but also making sure that housing is matched with jobs and some of the other services and things that people need to have a good quality of life. So big picture, when we look at city planning, I know everybody thinks the chief planner is probably all powerful and you just get to point at sites and say, thou shalt be a tower and thou shalt be a school. Doesn't quite work that way. Planning itself at the local level is very tightly controlled and limited and managed by provincial legislation. All planning is exercised under the authority of the Provincial Planning Act. It spells out what municipalities, what council, what staff can and cannot require as part of development applications. So that's defined in provincial policy and legislation. And then at the local level, our primary planning document is what we call our official plan. I'll talk about that in a second. And then within that official plan, we have different, sometimes a citywide strategy, like our climate action strategy and some other examples there. Sometimes we have area specific plans, might be a secondary plan for a neighborhood area or a corridor plan for a certain stretch of streets. So the planning kind of gets more and more granular. But all of those municipal strategies, those sort of bottom 4 things on that list, are all nested within and limited by what the provincial legislation spells out in terms of what we can and cannot require. So next slide. So this is the city's official plan. So this is the primary land use planning document that guides growth and development. It includes chapters on land use, on implementation, on infrastructure, and all of the things that we want to have to support growth. I'm going to watch my time and go through these next couple of slides. I'll go through fairly quickly. So what does complete communities mean? And maybe I'll share a bit of a sort of a, when I first got here, one of the first meetings I had was with the mayor, because that's important. And so on my first week on the job, I sat down with the mayor and I asked her, okay, I'm the new chief planner. What do you expect? What do you want the new chief planner to be focused on? And she, of course, talked about housing and affordable housing as a very high priority. But she also very quickly kind of talked about, it can't just be about how much housing we're building, and it can't just be about the quantity of housing we're building. It has to be about the quality of neighborhoods we're creating. And we talked a lot about parks and libraries and rec centers and transit and all of these other things that are really the fundamental components of what I would say are complete communities. So very quick list, I'll go through this quickly in terms of some of the things that are happening that are not just about housing growth, but about actually making sure that the growth that's happening is delivering complete communities. So major investments happening in mobility and public space. Actually, just flip back to that one real quick, because this I just find is a fascinating graphic. This is sort of the future high order transit system of Toronto, subways, LRT. And I just kind of circled in red the stuff that's kind of new, under construction, in detail design. And just visually, you can be like, that's like as much transit as we have had for the last 20 years, just being like doubled. So I know right now what that feels like is a lot of construction happening in the city, but in future, what it's going to feel like is a very well-connected transit-focused mobility system. I'll go quick through the last ones. Parks and public space. We're going to hear more about this, I'm sure, from Amanda, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is probably one of the top things I hear when you're talking in communities about growth is, okay, if more people are coming, where's the parks? Where's the public space to go with it? Next slide. Heritage. How do we make sure that new development and new growth is respecting and celebrating either preserving or integrating some of our heritage buildings? And you've got one of the smartest heritage architects here, and Michael, who will be speaking in a moment about that. Community facilities. So as I said, the rec centers, the libraries, the swimming pools, the daycares, all of those sorts of things that we need to invest in to make sure we're delivering excellent neighborhoods. Indigenous spaces, a couple of very significant ones happening not too far from here in terms of recent investments in terms of housing, healthcare facilities, economic development opportunities. Beauty and design excellence. This is an important one because sometimes you can get lost in the like, how much are we building? Let's just build lots. But like, let's not forget that it's, you know, the stuff we build today is the stuff that we are handing down to future generations in terms of the city we're creating. So let's make it beautiful. Let's make it excellent. Let's make it things that we can be proud of. Let's hand down to the next generation some of those buildings that we inherited from past generations that we are now fighting to protect. We should be building some buildings today that future generations will fight to protect 40, 50 years from now. Environmental sustainability. Toronto's been a bit of an innovator here with the Toronto Green Standard and actually starting to look at things like embodied carbon in new construction. Joy and vibrancy. That's not really a planning term, I admit. I don't think you'll find those words in the Planning Act. I should check sometime, but I don't think you'll find those words in the Planning Act. But it's extremely important. Like, you know, we're creating a community here. Like, it's a place where you want to have people can have fun, whether that's in public space, whether that's in entertainment facilities and theaters and art and all of those sorts of things, the kinds of things that make it joyful to live in a community. Over time, how do I go quickly through affordability? Well, you're going to be hearing more from Eric in a moment, and I'm sure he'll kind of hit on the question of affordability. But again, if we're going to build communities and we're going to create all this growth and development, it's got to be a welcoming community and has something for everybody, both existing residents and some of the new people that want to call Toronto home. And that speaks to equity inclusion as well. And you know, I think Toronto's done some really interesting work around tenant protection. I'll tell a very quick tangent story about tenant protection because I find it quite interesting. So the councillor said I came from Hamilton. I was there for 10 years and responsible for planning, but I was also responsible for a lot of other things like bylaw enforcement. And so we were having serious issue in Hamilton around tenant displacement. And so council directed me and my team to kind of figure out some solutions. And one of the things we did, we looked over at Toronto and we discovered Rent Safe TO, I believe is the program. And we stole it because we thought that was a program that was delivering some interesting benefits. And we basically crossed out the word Toronto, wrote in we even called it Rent Safe Hamilton. We did not try to change a whole lot because from what we could see, it was a program that was working pretty well. Then we did something else that no one had done before. We created, I think, a first in the country rent evictions bylaw and a bylaw to prevent rent evictions. And then I came here and Toronto stole from Hamilton to adopt the rent evictions bylaw where they didn't quite just cross out Hamilton and write in Toronto. Pretty close though. So to me, that's a neat example of like cities facing similar struggles and challenges, learning from each other. And I see no problem at all with like stealing from each other and borrowing from each other when people are putting forward good policy. And much more. That's not an exhaustive list of everything that comprises a complete community. There is much more to it, and maybe in the Q&A we can get into. Thank you. You probably move this down.
Thank you. And I'm happy Hamilton's taking things from Toronto and we'll take things from other municipalities. You know, I sit on various boards provincially and nationally. And when I meet with other mayors and councillors from other jurisdictions, we actually talked about commonalities and best practices. And we actually, you know, do copy them. So I'm happy that we're doing that. Next up is Michael McClelland, is a registered architect and the founding principal of PRA architect with over 30 years of experience in heritage conservation, heritage planning, and urban design. He has made significant contributions to the field. Michael began his career with the Toronto Historical Board and has since collaborated with various public and private stakeholders to promote culture through heritage planning, an active participant in Canadian architectural discourse. He has edited several books. I haven't read any of them yet, but I will. On urban conservation, and is currently the secretary of the ICONOS Canada Working Group. His work reflects a commitment to value-based design and conservation. Michael, it's all yours. Welcome.
We're good. I'm gonna set my timer, but if they just yank me off if I thought. I'm basically a heritage architect. I work with older buildings, fixing older buildings. I find over the period of time I've been working on this, the field has changed immensely. There are many new, different ideas about how to approach things. I want to talk about heritage values, but also other values that work with heritage to make a complete city. So next slide. So although I'm a big promoter of heritage, I've also been a bit of a contrarian. So I've complained about how heritage districts may actually freeze neighborhoods and may not work well for neighborhoods. Should I speak into this? Okay. And I'm concerned about the Ontario Heritage Act and how limited it is. I'm a critic of a lot of the heritage practices that occur in Toronto. Next slide. And if you think about heritage, I think this is a modern building, but I think many people would recognize it's a landmark. And so I'd say this is highbrow heritage. And so it's heritage, everyone recognizes sort of, this is obviously we must conserve this heritage. And that's what highbrow heritage means to me. And then the next slide is lowbrow. And we start to get into a funny territory where there's stuff. Is it important? Is it a significant landmark? Is it how do we judge it? How do we evaluate it? And there's a lot of discussion and differences of opinion, which are very valuable, frankly. The idea about people having different ideas about what heritage constitutes. So the next slide. So you may not be able to read this slide very well, but I look at heritage values as being one component piece of the values that we need to consider. So when I'm looking at a heritage building, I'm also thinking about several other things. So there's heritage values, which are very they work in a certain way, but there's also social equity values. So is what I'm looking at, does it work for a specific community? Does it support a specific community? Does it engage, and is it relevant to a specific community? There's also environmental consideration, environmental values, and these values may all conflict with each other. So someone thinking about environmental values may not have an interest in heritage buildings. So you need to balance all of these pieces. And environmental values are extremely important. And then a fourth one is economic value. Is it actually, what you're talking about, does it actually make sense economically? Is it possible to achieve what you're looking at? And any project we work on, it's like a little wagon, and we need to get all the wheels on the wagon for it to work and for it to be an effective project. Next one. I'm going to read this quote because this is about 10 years old, but it's on the topic of new heritage. And this is how Graham Fairclough was working for Heritage England at the time. And it's new heritage suggests that instead of finding the best, calling it heritage, and fighting to keep it, we should look with open eyes at all that exists around us, accepting that at some level it is all heritage, and then decide how to use it best for social and future values, but also projecting into the future. That might involve traditional preservation, but it might not. And so this is where internationally heritage is bound right at the moment. This, as I said, this is about 10 years old, this particular quote. But there's a concern worldwide that heritage needs to think of many different things. It needs to think of tangible built things, but it also needs to think of intangible cultural things. It needs to consider not only a building, but the uses of that building. And there's a whole broad range of stuff that we need to consider. So it gets very messy at a certain point. It's just like really complicated. Next slide. But we've been testing this out in various ways in our office. So in 2007, we wrote a book called Concrete Toronto, or edited a book called Concrete Toronto. Why I did that is because people hated concrete buildings. When I was anytime I got into an elevator, they say, "Oh, you hate Robert's Library. You're an architect. You must hate Robert's Library." And I said, "No, actually, I kind of love Robert's Library." And so we did a book that kind of celebrated the concrete buildings in the city. And this was to tease out our interest in things that aren't currently recognized as having significant values. So that led to another project. Next slide. But actually tower renewal. So it led to an effective project where we started to look at the ugliest buildings in the city, the apartment slabs, and started to talk about how an amazing resource they are. I think that we need to actually think of conserving them. We need to actually think of treating them like heritage buildings. We need to understand the planning areas they sit in. We need to understand the diversity of people who live in them. We need to understand the importance of these buildings to our city, and then that we can't let them fall apart. So we actually have to figure out strategies for maintaining them. Next slide. Another thing we did was look at the ward. The ward was an area that was demolished to build new city hall, pretty much. And there we wanted to tease out the idea about intangible things that don't exist anymore. There's only faint kind of recognitions of these neighborhoods within in a particular area. And these were two books. We did one when we thought there was nothing there, and then a second one when we found a lot of archaeological resources that were there. But these books were actually a way to reflect on Toronto's past and think about issues like racism, urban renewal, how we treat the poor, and all of these. And basically, this was a neighborhood that now would be like Kensington Market, amazingly diverse. And we also, for several years, we threw a cabaret. We did the music from the ward at Illuminato and other places like that. And so it was an idea about just celebrating something that had disappeared, but actually had for us a sense of intangible value. We needed intangible heritage value. Next slide. And we're still looking at the suburbs. We're dreaming of a day when the suburban houses like these may be looked upon the same way we look at Cabbagetown houses now. Just try to understand how we might see them as relevant within their own period and of significance to people in a way that we don't think of them now. So that's the thing about future values, right? Next slide. And that interest in the suburbs led us to look at the strip mall. Another adorable kind of feature of the city. We looked at the strip malls and sort of considered whether we could actually make improvements there. So we developed a program called Plaza Pops, which has now sprung into many different areas. But Plaza Pops was an idea about exploring the parking out in front of these retail lots to see if we could make a temporary urban improvement in those neighborhoods. Next slide. And Allen Gardens, this is my favorite project. But we looked at Allen Gardens. Allen Gardens is a park. Allen Gardens was built in 1860, opened in 1860. So that's a long time ago. When it opened, the entire population of Toronto was 40,000 people. 40,000 people. And so the idea that park serviced not that many people. Now I think you could easily count 40,000 people in the median juxtaposition of Allen Gardens. So we're looking at issues of sustainability. We're looking at how can you make the park the best thing it's possibly, the best thing it can do, and how can it service as many people as possible? How can it have active programming in it that really functions well to address the needs of the community? And so we've been working on this for a number of years, and I've got to thank the councillor's office for being so supportive of the work we're doing there. I think I've got one more slide. This is my last slide. We're starting to work on a project called Art in the Waterfront. And in that case, we're expanding the idea beyond heritage to think about heritage as one component of culture. And we're looking at the city's culture plan to sort of say it needs some assistance and help to figure out how we can address the loss of artists' spaces in the city of Toronto, art spaces, art workspaces, and we're proposing the waterfront would be the place to do that. And so we're looking at Waterfront Toronto turning its logo of leading with landscape to leading with art and culture. And we'll see how far we get with that. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy you mentioned Plaza Pops because I know that project quite well. It was one of the projects that actually brought me over to Copenhagen last year. And I'm sure Amanda will talk about it when she speaks later. And I'm trying to do my best to actually bring Plaza Pops here to Toronto Center as well, because I think there's a value in bringing it down to the core here as well. And Brandon is the lead researcher along with Jennifer. I can't remember their last names because that's the way we roll. Anyways, up next is Eric Lombardi. Eric is the president and founder of More Neighbors Toronto, an advocacy organization dedicated to ending the housing crisis through housing abundance. He writes on occasion for the Hub and the Toronto Star, focusing on housing and economic issues facing the next generation. Privately, he is a management consultant in the finance and technology sector. He's a young, brilliant guy. Coming up, Eric.
All right. So thank you everyone for also coming tonight. I know it's not, always easy to take time out of our everyday lives to talk about our city. And one of the lenses I want to focus on in my presentation in particular is on the role of public engagement, as I know it's going to be a topic on our panel later. And so I'll do a bit of a deep dive there. But I also just want to talk about the housing crisis and the factors that contribute to it and why it's important for us to prioritize affordability and how we think about how we plan, approve, and build in this city. Slides. There's a great introduction, so I'm probably not going to go into it. I grew up in the GTA. I love Toronto, and I really want the city to be the greatest city on earth, and I think we can do that. So More Neighbors Toronto started in the mid of 2021 during the pandemic, and also we were seeing an explosive rise in the cost of housing. And the role of More Neighbors Toronto was really to combat what I would say is an anti-housing disposition that we saw a lot within city government and also on public engagement. And oftentimes the conversations about housing end up being very polarizing or very ideological, and we want to find ways to bridge some of the gaps between how the left and the right think about solutions to this problem. Our vision is more neighbors and more neighborhoods, and the fact that when you bring people together, you get more innovation, you get more ideas, you get more culture, you get more restaurants and cafes, and you have scale to deliver higher quality services. So more neighbors really means more opportunities and more of what we love in our cities. And we're really just an organization dedicated to bringing people who care about city building together in order to ensure that voices that have not been traditionally represented in these conversations have that opportunity. Yeah. So a couple of our values, these are all on our website, but I think some of the big ones to me is yes and. Typically there's a path forward on most problems that we have that is not just opposition. And I think finding the nuance is important to us, as well as being big tent. So from left to right, if you care about housing, you can be a part of More Neighbors. Next slide. This is just some social reach statistics. We can get through it and we can talk about the housing crisis. So as you know, the housing costs are out of control. We've seen this explosion in the relative cost and affordability of housing relative to incomes. And so on this image, you're really just seeing a comparison between Canada and the United States. And things have gotten really silly here. And if you look at the city level as well, Toronto now ranks as one of the most expensive cities in the developed world relative to the cost of living. And the sad part is that this did really happen in a very short period of time. And there are consequences to all of this. Key consequences that we like to highlight are generational impacts. I do think young people are feeling the brunt of affordability issues in a way that I think sometimes older generations don't appreciate just how hard it is for people to combat sort of this milestone recession that stems from not being able to afford adequate shelter in terms of starting families and these traditional milestones, adulthood, the environmental consequences, particularly in the ways that we've approached building our cities. We do know that, suburban sprawl has had major both economic and environmental consequences for the long term. We also know that the way that we've designed our cities hasn't always been fully inclusive, and there'll be an image shortly that will kind of explain that in a little bit more deep. And economic, all the lost economic potential of our city going into rents or to mortgage interest is not economic spending that goes back into our economy, that helps people start new businesses and ultimately improve our lives in a meaningful way, not just in numbers. And the reality is we're just not building enough homes. I know we had the Crane Index earlier, but the fact that we have so many high rises being built actually is a bit of an illusion when it actually comes down to how much space that we're building, because in so many neighborhoods up until now, we actually have not allowed housing to be built. And so this image on the right here, everywhere you see in pink is a neighborhood that has fewer people in it today or in 2021 than they did in 1970. And that's actually the vast majority of our city. And land use and permitting, zoning, all these are factors for why so much of what we've built has been so concentrated, and we're getting the outcomes in that we're experiencing. Some of the others on this side, I think the presentation kind of shrunk them a bit. If you look at income levels, right? The areas with the highest income are the areas that are actually shrinking the most. If you look at transit access, many of these areas that haven't grown have great accessibility. And so the point is, we talk a lot about markets and like the housing market, but markets aren't free or not free. They're competitive or not competitive. And to the extent that the housing market has become a non-competitive market and causing so many consequences, is not a consequence of nebulous factors that are out of our control, but the consequence of the policies that we have in place and the incentives that they drive towards outcomes. So we're gonna go to the next slide. This is the number of completions per year across housing types in Ontario. You'll actually see that in terms of number of completions, kind of been flat despite that we've doubled in population in this time. But it gets even worse. When you account for the actual amount of space that we're building per new person, it's actually fallen quite a bit. If you go to the next slide, it'll illustrate it even better. So if we look at the 2023 data that we have and the actual mix of housing that we're producing, which once was much larger single family units to a lot more condos and apartments, even though we're building a lot of units, we're actually not building a lot of space, particularly for all the new residents that we're having. Hence, we've arrived at a situation where we have a housing crisis. So why aren't we building more? Trying to do my best to explain this, but essentially to all new construction, there's a price floor of viability. And in a neutral environment where you're not adding more people, costs will relatively balance out. But as you start adding more people, the price of existing housing will rise to justify eventually people buying more new housing. And in a great environment, this is a little bit of an economics lesson. I'm sorry, I'll try to be quick. What you want in any market is for supply to be elastic, which means when there's increases in demand, the result is people produce more of the thing that people want at the same price. That's really the goal in any market. So to the extent that prices are rising, but also we're not getting more housing being produced, is a sign of an inelastic market, which means, in this case, that the barriers and costs to new housing are rising at the same time that the cost of housing is rising as well. And so if we were to do a comparison of what it looks like to build a new unit of housing adjusted for inflation, so this number 2,000 would be closer to 250,000 for a two-person bedroom. It's risen dramatically, and there's a lot of cost components to this that I'm not going to have the time to justify in this presentation, but happy to answer questions on it. But if we want to make housing cheaper in the city, we need to lower the cost basis for producing new housing. Because similar for a new car, you're not going to buy a used car of the same brand if the new version costs less. So we do need to care about the price of new housing, not just the price of all housing, if we want the cost of housing broadly to go down. And this obviously applies to rents too. So I have a thing about how we can get there. And, we have to think about taxes and profits and soft costs and hard costs and land. But what I really want to address today was, what's the role of public consultation in this process? So we consult the public in Toronto for, I think, pretty good reasons. Historically, we did see, go to the next slide. In the past, we had planners and government sometimes steamroll neighborhoods without really their consultation. So consulting the public and making sure that people are involved in the development of the neighborhoods is obviously a good thing. But should every project that we do have a public consultation? I think this is one of the problems. You can go to the next slide as well. I think this is increasingly one of the problems. One of my examples here is a 12-month consultation on rebuilding the paths in Trinity Bellwood. I think people would actually just prefer that some experts design this and move forward on a build. We don't need to necessarily spend a year consulting about some of this stuff, right? And there are several other problems of public consultation today. One, there are just too many. We consult for basically everything that we build in the city. Every new project, it doesn't need to be this way. They're also not always representative. They tend to be older, tend to be more dominated by existing homeowners, and they tend to be less diverse in the city at large. They tend to get dominated by higher agency individuals who have the time to show up. A mother who is cooking dinner at 6 p.m. doesn't have time to go to the local community center because someone is building a building. And then they also create bad incentives in some ways, because when everything we do requires public engagement, it actually creates incentives for councillors and politicians to sort of have this battle rather than follow a clear set of rules that applies fairly evenly to everyone. And so some of the things I just want to mention, I realize I'm probably going over time now. Time is money, so we need to talk about the cost of public consultation and time it takes. Go to the next slide. We need to also talk about why does it take so long to build the housing that we are building, and what role does public consultation have in driving out that process? And that in the future, we need solutions. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to race these. That the process that we put in place around what we build should be transparent and applied evenly, and having higher agency or wealthier individuals in a given area should not necessarily reflect the outcomes of what gets built and where. And I think this is a fundamental area in which our city has gotten wrong in our history. And so, what I want to talk about more is a consultation model that looks to more proactive engagement about what neighborhoods should look like. What kinds of architecture do we want at the street level? What kinds of amenities do we want builders to know that we're missing in their neighborhood, so they might design around it, rather than always saying, hey, project by project, we're going to do a consultation on an individual building that ignores the context of the neighborhood. And there is already some progress in this direction. Anyway, so that's sort of my presentation for today. Looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
I told you he was brilliant. When I was running for office initially, one of the first people I met with was with Eric and More Homes Tomorrow. Morehouse is More Neighbors Toronto. And I was inspired from day one. And I took that message with me throughout even to today. One of the first conversations I had about the organization was with the president of TMU. And I said, you cannot just build standalone buildings. You need to actually build homes above them. And that stuck with him, because every so often he calls me and say, look, I'm doing what you asked me to do. And I met with him today and we talked about it today. So, and here you are today. So thank you for always inspiring and pushing all of us. And what I also love about your organization too, is that it's driven by young people, and that's so important. So thank you. Our next speaker is Amanda O'Rourke, is the Executive Director of 880 Cities, bringing over 20 years of expertise in strategic planning and partnership development. She has spearheaded award-winning public spaces design projects across Canada and the US. She has also led city leadership training in North America, Europe, and Australia. Renowned as a placemaking leader, writer, and speaker, Amanda collaborates with city governments and communities to advance health, equity, and sustainability. She holds a Master's of Science in Urban Planning from the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology from Queen's University. Amanda is co-chair of World Urban Parks and an advisory board member for Healthy Places by Design. She was named one of the 10 most loved Torontonians by Spacing Magazine. Amanda. And I had the privilege of spending a week with her in Copenhagen.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to take a temperature check first. I spent some of my time in Southern US, and one of the first things we always do is just take the temperature of the crowd. How y'all doing? How y'all doing? Yes. Okay, good, good, good. So I have the pleasure of doing the last presentation. Thank you to the fellow panelists. What a great setup to talk about building complete communities and placemaking. You can go to the next slide. So I run an organization called 880 Cities, which is a nonprofit organization. We're based right here in Toronto, but we work all over. And we're guided by a very simple, but we think powerful idea. And that is, what if everything we did in our cities was great for an 8-year-old and an 8-year-old? We think if you start there, start with that question, we can create better cities for everyone and create healthy, happy cities for people to grow up in and grow old in, and where people have access to great parks, public spaces, affordable housing, and accessible city building processes. So our mission as a nonprofit is to ignite action and challenge the status quo to create healthier, more equitable and sustainable cities for everyone. We always say that 880 is the starting point, not the end point. It's really just a way to get you thinking about, who are we designing the city for? Who are we leaving out? And it's a way to open up a conversation about broader equity and social location. So age is one way that we navigate our city, but of course, our race, our gender, our ability, our socioeconomic status, these all intersect and interplay in terms of our experience navigating the city and having a neighborhood and a community that feels like a place where we belong. So we've been at this we're actually about to hit our 20th anniversary this November. I've been there since the beginning with the wonderful founder, Gil Peñalosa. You may have heard of him. And Gil started his city building career late 1990s in Bogota. And then when he came to Toronto in the greater Toronto area, he started 880 Cities, based on this idea that you can use the city's wonderful assets and public spaces as a way to support social equity outcomes. So we've been at it for a number of years. As I said, we've been in over 400 cities on 5 continents. And again, our real vision as an organization is to support the creation of cities for everyone, really, where everyone has, you can go to the next slide, the right to public space, the right to mobility, and the right to participate. To us, this is very much about reclaiming the right to the city for everyone. It's a very much a human rights-based approach that we take to thinking about who has the ability to walk safely across the street or ride their bicycle or use public transit. Who has the right to enjoy parks and public spaces where they feel a sense of community and belonging, and they feel safe and comfortable. And who has the right to participate in city building processes. And I'm so glad that we talked about public consultation, because that's a big part of what we do, is trying to really think more creatively about how to engage people in city building beyond the very traditional public consultation approaches that have often failed to deliver on good outcomes. But with this responsibility, with this right to the city, we also recognize that with great rights come great responsibilities. And this has been a new element of our framing at 880 Cities, a lot of which has been through engagement with Indigenous folks who have really in Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, of not just thinking about this human-based approach, but thinking about our responsibility to the land and to each other. So at the end of the day, people often ask, okay, those are great lofty goals and mission and vision, but what do you actually do? You're often traveling around the world and doing different things, but what do you do? And if I had to summarize it in one sentence, I would say this, that we bring people together to transform mobility and public space. Because we believe that these are the ways to actually advance those big outcomes that we have and those big lofty goals around health, equity, and sustainability. So I want to talk a little bit about how we bring people together to transform mobility in public space. And one of the frameworks that we've come up with is called the TASTE framework. And this came about really based on a lot of frustration, to Eric's point about public consultation processes often really failing to deliver on good outcomes. And we really like to try to transform space quickly and actively through a participatory approach and give people a taste of what's possible because we believe that this is a big part of how you actually can enact change in cities. So we go through temporary, affordable, strategic, testing in real time, and evidence-driven. So temporary, we do a lot of temporary activations in space to reimagine what the space could look like through an engaged approach. Affordable, we do it at a very low cost and very quickly often. We engage with community, get ideas, and take quick action as a sort of iterative, agile approach. We are always strategic. We're not event planners. We don't just do programming to do programming. This is about how do we use this activation or public space transformation to actually advance a broader placemaking goal, to actually advance broader investment in the public realm, because we think the public realm has such an important role to play when it comes to health, equity, and sustainability. Yes. So to give you an example of how we employ this TASTE framework, here's some projects that we did. This was one we did in 2019 along the Danforth. We transformed one block along with the wonderful partners at the Better Block Foundation. And we transformed one block of the street temporarily into a complete street with separated cycle facilities, pedestrian-oriented spaces, cafe seating. And that temporary activation that lasted a weekend then helped inspire a longer-term activation during the pandemic. Another example is our school streets programs. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures. We really wanted to test this idea of the space directly in front of schools. The space that is often loaded with cars, traffic, and exhaust. And not a really conducive space for children's joy, happiness, and freedom of movement. And so in 2019, we did the first pop-up school streets in Toronto. And little did we know that this would inspire a broader movement in Ontario. And now we just received funding to do a national program, and this is rolling out across 30 cities across Canada. So sometimes temporary, this was a 4-day activation where we collected evidence about the impact. We built a model, and now it is scaling out across Canada. Why not put a play structure at an intersection? Why not? We really like to play with these ideas to test people's imagination and to see what's possible. The streets are a public space. That means it belongs to each and every one of us. So a lot of these projects are really about provoking new ideas and new thinking and reminding us that actually we can decide what to do with this space. And when we decide to put a playground in here, guess what happens? Children come and they play and they experience joy. And actually, one of the things that we collected, the data we collected on this project, this was in Kitchener, where we did a pop-up park along King Street in the main downtown street, was we found that adults played the most on this. And they were invited to play in the street. And we also found that the data spiked past 5 o'clock for children. And this happens a lot in our projects in the downtowns, where people, if we do a pre-study, there's very few children in the downtown in the evening. And as soon as we do an activation or play elements, you suddenly remember that, oh yeah, the city is also for children and they exist in the space. So many times people will tell me at the beginning of a project, oh, there's no children here. They're here. They just haven't been invited to use the space. Go to the next. That's the aerial view of the pop-up park. We also tested a lot of community ideas that came about around celebrating cultural ceremony. We also hosted the first prayer session in the public space with a local imam, because we did engagement with the South Asian and Muslim community, who said that they didn't feel comfortable praying in the public space. And this was a key thing that they wanted to do in their parks and public spaces. So much of the work that we do is about testing ideas, provoking ideas, and generating momentum around broader investments. So the Danforth project, if you've biked along Danforth, you can see the pilot. It's actually no longer a pilot, it's a permanent installation of the separated cycle tracks. The school streets, you know, we are doing this national movement across many cities in Canada. And in Kitchener, while they didn't do, this pop-up park was to test ideas for their parks master plan. What they did do is take this idea of the playground and create a permanent pedestrian street with a play structure in one of the side streets. So a lot of these projects can generate a lot of momentum relatively quickly. We can go to the next. Oh, here's the fire. So fun. We've also done projects where we activate underused laneways. And one of the reasons I like this picture is that the chess tables were already there. We did some beautification, and the street mural we also curated with a local artist. But one of the, I think, beautiful and powerful elements of this kind of approach is using existing assets that are already there. So the chess tables were there, but we worked with a local organization that does chess lessons for youth, and we asked them to come and use the space. And as soon as they were there, it like really added a lot of vibrancy to the space, and people were invited and given sort of this opportunity to use the space. Go ahead. Oh, we also tested a night market, which is one of the things we heard community really wanted to try out. A lot of, this is in Brampton. We heard a lot from the community engagement that folks really liked the night markets from back home and didn't really have an example here in Canada. So we tested some of these ideas in the public space, which generated a lot of interest. Go ahead. And this is actually connected to Michael's comment about Plaza Pops. So one of the wonderful projects that we are embarking on right now, and I don't have the after picture yet, but it's cooking, it's coming. And this is the community co-design process that we are doing right now. We are going to be transforming 2 sites. So it's coming to Toronto already, one in Rockcliffe Smythe and the other in Cooksville. And we're working with 2 tower communities, activating the underused space in close proximity to these towers that often do not have high access to quality public space. So a lot more to come on the Tower Pops initiative, but a wonderful collaboration with ERA and Plaza Pops and amazing community partners, including United Way and the cities, both City of Mississauga and City of Toronto. Okay, so these are my last slides. Councillor Moyes asked me to talk about challenges. And so I wanted to try to condense them down into a few points. So I have 6 points, but I've reframed them as more opportunities because I'm an optimist at heart. And so I think these are like really broad things that we've learned over the course of working for 20 years in this space. If we want to change in outcomes, if we want the streets to be safer, more equitable, more vibrant, if we want our parks to be more accessible and inclusive and culturally responsive, we have to change the actions. So change in outcomes requires a change in actions. And that's a big part of the sensibility that we bring to our work is action, iterate, respond, feedback, go again, try again, go again. We really like this idea of playfully pushing boundaries and as a powerful tool in practice. When you create a playful environment, people are much more creative and they are much more open to change. So a lot of our work is about doing things that people kind of get shooken out up about because it helps them kind of be open to new opportunities and new possibilities. Next. Placemaking is a process, not an outcome. You know, complete communities are never complete. We are always going. You are never finished. Next. We can't do this alone. So much of our work relies on collaboration and partnerships. And I'm so glad the chief planner is here because I would love this message to really resonate. And I think the city has a lot of opportunity here around being more permeable and open to partnerships. Because I think that these community organizations and grassroots organizations are really doing this strong work and we need the barriers to be removed and the city to think of itself more as a facilitator and less as a regulator. Friction equals traction. This is one of the things I often tell my team when we get some pushback on our ideas. When we're getting pushback on ideas, it often also means that we're getting somewhere. And we have to get a bit more used to feeling that friction and feeling a bit more comfortable with that friction. Because if you're not getting friction, you're probably not doing anything different. Next. Okay, last one. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. I love this quote. It's Eisenhower, randomly. But I'm a planner. I did my master's in planning. I love planning. Planning is not the same as making plans. And I think one of the things that I think is really important for us to remember, especially at this moment of a lot of economic instability, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, certainly climate change as another aspect of unpredictability and instability, is that a lot of our planning systems have been created under a very different environment where we had a lot of sort of forecasted growth and forecasted economic stability. And it's very different right now. And so I think we really need to adapt more of an like ongoing planning, as opposed to making plans and then going back to the plan and doing the plan and realizing we only did 20% of the plan. So I think this is a sensibility that's really important, especially at this moment of such rapid change. But thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Amanda. I just love her energy. Oh my goodness. And I'm inspired by her and her team each and every day through 880 cities. I've learned so much. And this is why, I'm trying to affect as much change in Toronto Center and across the city as possible. There's so much more that should be and will be done. So we're going to take a few minutes to rearrange the room a little bit and bring up our panelists. And maybe perhaps in the interim, you could grab a bite to eat. There's some snacks there, some coffee and some tea and cheese and those wonderful things. So give us 2 minutes while we rearrange the room. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna get started shortly. Grab a drink and come and grab your seat. We have less than an hour. So I just want to also mention that this is being live streamed and we do have people viewing us online as well. So we can see you, but we know you're there. And thank you to all those who are joining us today in person as well. Much appreciated. We could start, right? So I will start. That's the first question, but really this is about you and the opportunity for you to ask questions of the panelists. But just to warm us up, I'll ask the first question to each of the panelists. What does a healthy, equitable, and complete community look like to you? Anyone can take it away. Here, there.
So I think there'd be several factors in what I would define as a, complete community, and one that's also quite healthy. I think the first one as a housing advocate is that quality housing is attainable to most people based on the incomes that exist in that area. I think that's a really important factor and sometimes a trade-off that we don't always think about in the factors of livability. The second piece I would say is that there's a diversity of housing types and incomes within a community. So to the extent that we have a stronger social bond between classes when we all live in proximity to one another, I think is very much undervalued. I think we also, I'm an urbanist, and I also personally just think that the difference between great cities and not so great cities is just that are trees available broadly and when you're walking around. And so the extent that, we see natural environment in our day-to-day life, I think is important and often not the type of hard trade-off that we often need. I think the fourth thing is entertainment and things to do. So I think in this era where we've oftentimes lost a sense of connection to the people around us, we've probably undervalued the need for what people would call third spaces. So places where you can run into friends or neighbors in an unstructured fashion and be able to meet and connect with the rudeness that I think is important in order for people to value where they live. There's probably other factors that I am not thinking of, but to me, a nice community that isn't affordable isn't inclusive. A inclusive affordability that isn't nice is also not inclusive. So, I think we need to make sure that when we're thinking about growth, that we think about the benefits of it, both on the types of people who can live in the community, how they live in it, and then how they experience it. Thank you.
Well, I'll go next. Okay, I think my approach is always to think through a very people-centered, human-centered approach, and I would say it really comes down to me to a place where everyone can reach their full potential and feel like they can thrive.
I think it's a bit like your 880 thing, where if you're a kid and you live in the suburbs, you have to have a car. You have to get your parents to drive you places to get anywhere, and I think that's where the breakdown. If it's very car oriented, it's the problem. And 880 means that also elderly people need to be able to get around as well. So you can do that in the downtown core. But it's very difficult to do that in other parts of the city. So I think we need to when we think of communities, we need to think of what that means in different areas of the city.
I'm gonna answer through the lens of if you go to a city you've never been to before, and how can you tell? You go to a place you've never been before. How can you tell? Is this a complete thriving community? And my background is actually in science. I don't tell the counselor I don't have a planning background. And as a science, I just study environmental science, and I would say you look for the indicator species. If you want to see if an ecosystem is healthy and thriving, look for the indicator species. So what are the indicator species of a really great, healthy community? Well, there's people of all ages and all abilities and all cultures out and about and enjoying the place, If you're in a place you've never been to before and you just kind of walk around a neighborhood, and I do this because I'm a bit of a cities nerd and just kind of sit in a public space or sit on a street corner and just observe. If you see that, then you know there's probably something behind it that is working really well. If you don't see that, if you see empty streets, if you see empty parks, then there's probably an underlying problem.
Thank you. Yeah, those are good answers. You know, when I was in Copenhagen, because that's what I'm going to go to, going beyond my borders and experience different things, you know, I recognized that seniors were able to come out and use the urban spaces and socialize. That helped them mentally, physically, and emotionally, because they recognize there's an isolation aspect of it. Even today, you know, I sit on Economic and Development Committee, ECDC, I always forget what it stands for. But one of the key items on today's agenda was the coyotes in downtown core and how it's impacting people and how they engage in community. And so we also have to make space for animals too, right? Wild animals. So all those things are important. Again, it's not about me, but it's about you. And do you have any questions for the panelists? There's one in the back. You could direct, there's a mic, because we do have people online, so they need to hear you as well. And you can direct the question to either all the panelists or individual panelists.
I think all the panel. Thank you very much for being here. It was very good. I learned a few stuff myself. One thing I want to know is that because we live in downtown and the density is getting higher and higher, we are having all these towers all in downtown around Yonge Street and around the front. And I don't think that this density is equal to the infrastructure that we have. We don't have enough park space for people. We don't have community space for all the people that are now coming to downtown. So what are we going to do about the infrastructure, about the parks, about the community spaces? How are we going to provide them for this very high density that we have? But anyway, the second thing is that is about lack of losing all the heritage. Yes. Thank you very much.
I think you just kind of listed the chief planner's job description. But I'll speak maybe to your first question and then let others weigh in. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the role of planning, the role of long-term thinking is we know growth is coming. And we know we have, to some of Eric's point, we have a housing crisis, and this is a city where people want to be. And we have to make sure we are delivering that housing. And in a city like this, a lot of that's going to come in higher density forms. I would say it's not just happening in the downtown core. We're seeing tower sites all over the city and more of that kind of, as I said earlier, mid-rise, middle scale of housing. But a big part of the planning process is around trying to get ahead of that, or at least stay with that in terms of all of the services that have to go with it. And that's kind of why I gave what was admittedly just a partial list of kind of the elements that make up a complete community that we have to plan for. And one of the challenges, especially in an area like this, in the downtown core of a big growing urban city, it gets more and more difficult to find and create the opportunities to create those spaces, to create those parks and public spaces. I think on the slide on parks and public spaces, the image I showed was the Bentway. And one of the reasons for that is I think it's a very clever way of carving out public space and public realm from the kind of the nooks and crannies of the city, because that's the kind of approach you have to take in a very dense urban environment. Integrating the schools and the rec centers as part of that new development is the kind of thing you have to do when you have a city that's as dense and growing as this. You got to get much more creative about how you deliver those kinds of that infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and then you have to anticipate what the need's going to be so that it's there for the people who are coming. I'll let others.
I can talk about the heritage piece a little bit because it's actually very interesting. I think right now we have conflicting policies. So there's really an issue that there's a lot of development that's required in the downtown core, and yet we have frankly unclear policies about heritage conservation and what we're trying to achieve. If with heritage conservation, it can be, for example, you save the silver dollar facade, but you don't save the silver dollar. Right. So it's a very fundamental issue that then you're left with a space and you've actually restored the interior space to look like the silver dollar, but it doesn't work anymore. So there's whole issues around what we think is important and how we're managing that. And I think Jason and I are going to work on that. We'll figure out, because I think there are policies that are unclear. They're set up in a combative nature. Which doesn't really help the planning process generally. So we need to all work together to resolve this in a better way.
I would just add, I love the nooks and crannies. Those are the places that we like to find, but that there is actually a lot of space to work with. I think there is a lot of density, but there's also a lot of existing space that we can be more creative with, to Jason's point. And a lot of it is taken up with car infrastructure and parking. And it is about really looking at the space and the value for that space and the best use of that space, given that we've grown tremendously as a population. And it doesn't make sense for us to have so much space dedicated to cars in a highly dense urban environment. Yeah.
I just wanted to throw in something. Dog parks. Clarence Square is one of my favorite squares in the city of Toronto. It's an 18th century square, early 19th century square, a potentially beautiful space, potentially beautiful, and as old as many of the major squares in London, for example. We have it half carved up for a dog park. I love dogs, but I have a real problem with us using our scarce public space for dog parks.
So I suppose I have several things to add to this question. I mean, I think I'm as frustrated as many others would be on this panel with how much space we just dedicate to on-street parking. And we have this debate about, well, should we have bike lanes? Well, it's like, well, like, I mean, could we have bike lanes and we could have wider sidewalks and more trees and more access to sort of a nice public realm? But there are 2 points that I want to make. And the first one is I would encourage you to also think about some of the people who are getting opportunities to live in that tower that has a facade that was retained for heritage. Like, those are people who had an opportunity to have access to jobs and like live their dreams in a city that they love, and like that has tangible value to us in the city. Otherwise, we wouldn't see these buildings being created in the first place. But on infrastructure, and this is no criticism, it's a collective problem, but the processes by which we actually approve and construct infrastructure in the city of Toronto and Ontario are flawed in many ways. So if you look at, for example, the Ontario line, it's coming in at 1.2 billion per kilometer. Comparable subway systems built in places like Paris come in at about 300 million. And the reason for that is we tend to do these as one-off projects where we've outsourced a substantial amount of risk to one consolidated project, and then the next project you use different standards. And instead of having an ongoing capital expense for building out infrastructure, we tend to do it as one-off approvals. And I think a good example as well is the Waterfront East LRT, where in the Toronto Portlands and what was once Villiers Island, we'll probably actually have housing before we have the LRT. And so changing the way that we actually think about how we incrementally build out the capital expenditure of infrastructure, and to the extent that projects don't have to get like 3 levels of government approval in order to get forward, I think is a meaningful problem that we probably need to talk about, especially in areas that are very infrastructure constrained like Toronto Centre.
Okay, I don't want to create such a long answer. The planner. I've been here a long time. The apartment I live in used to have, it still has, rent control on it. New ones don't, this type of thing. There's divide between, Young Street divides our community. Jarvis Street divides our community. There's all these little blocks all the way around. But what I've noticed is when you now have more corporations that own the apartment buildings that are investments that are, the whole idea is incentivizing it so that you get people to buy into your company. So they need money back out of their investment. And so many of the new towers are strictly sold as investment properties, where I'm sitting somewhere else on the planet, collecting my ka-ching from who's ever living there. And yes, they're fulfilling their hopes and dreams of living here, but they're not owning it, and they're never going to own it because somebody else owns it somewhere. How do you sort of balance it out so that we actually have housing that is built? And I think that when it's an investment, it adds a huge cost to a building. It adds a huge cost to the community because you don't have that sense of people bought it, they're moving into it, and they tend to be here for 5-10 years, rather than somebody who's fluctuating in and out for 2-3 years. I think building community needs some stable population, as well as people who are working through university or through different things and coming and going. But the investment idea of property is so different than it was 20 years ago, when you used to walk down and be able to just rent an apartment and somebody different owned it and you went over, whatever. Just, how do you deal with all that? How do you make sense of it without commenting on the government that thinks they run Toronto?
There's a lot in that question, and there's much that goes beyond planning, but there's a planning component to that. And so one of the sort of, I think, consequences of some of the stuff that Erica actually had spoken about earlier around when you only permit development in certain spots in the city, and you start to have these like constrained opportunities where you can have a tower site near a couple of your transit station areas, but all of the sort of the, as we call it, the neighborhoods are off limits, can't do anything there. You start to create a bit of scarcity, not a bit of scarcity, create a lot of scarcity. But what you also do is you start to create conditions where only certain developers and investors can actually, frankly, just afford to build and can afford to create housing. And so you get some of what you're talking about. One of the things that I'm optimistic about in terms of where Toronto has been shifting and this is fairly new stuff, like this is, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, which may seem like a long time, but in the planning world, that's like a blink of an eye, of these kinds of new opportunities being created for multiplexes in neighborhoods, for 6-story, 8-story, 10-story buildings, not just on a couple of sort of targeted streets, but across many streets all over the city. Is not only does that create opportunity for new housing, it creates opportunity for new investment and new businesses and new developer models and cooperative models. Like suddenly a whole bunch of more opportunity for different players, different actors in the development world. And we're seeing that in Toronto right now. I've met with some of them. I've met with builders who established companies just to respond to these new opportunities for smaller scale housing. They've created companies, they've created businesses that are doing very well, that are delivering 15, 20 units per year, which is kind of a lot of how development used to happen in cities like Toronto. It was not 4 or 5 companies delivering hundreds of units. It was hundreds of companies delivering a few units. And I think part of what I'm hoping for in terms of kind of opening up these opportunities through some of the new zoning permissions we're putting in is, again, it's not just going to create housing opportunity, but it's actually going to diversify the kinds of people that are doing building and companies that are doing building in the city.
Can I just piggyback on this really quickly? I also want to re-emphasize, like, put yourself in the mind of someone who wants to buy a place not to invest in, but to live in a community. You're not thinking 5 years about when you're going to move. You might be thinking, I want to move in like the next year or two. And so to the extent that the type of housing product that we've allowed are these very long time horizon products, which are, tall condo buildings, that's actually more inherently an investor product. So to the extent that we can reform what we're allowed to build, and that what gets built can be built in a year or two, well, suddenly now that's a time frame that families can fathom making a purchasing decision on. So to an extent, the type of housing we've allowed to be built in Toronto is very much geared towards an investor product rather than a people product. And to the extent that land reform is required to change that, I actually don't know how else we do it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the yellow belt refers to an area of Toronto that was residentially zoned, and the color used for that zoning type was yellow, hence we call it the yellow belt, in which up until a few years ago, only single family homes or occasionally townhouses were permitted as of right, which limited the amount of land available to build all other kinds of housing.
Hi, I have a question for the whole panel today. So how can we promote these free outdoor urban spaces in communities that are deemed high risk of high crime rates?
Thank you for your question. I think I'll talk about the Tower Pops initiative, which is basically that is the premise of our work on that project. ADD Cities is working with Plaza Pops as well as a number of different funders to bring activate underused public spaces or even privately owned, publicly accessible spaces in close proximity to tower communities that there was a whole selection process around identifying those neighborhoods based on a number of different criteria, one of which was social vulnerability. And so what this project does, I think, is similar to a lot of the other projects that we do, is like show a model and demonstrate a model that can then be replicated. Our goal is to create a playbook that can then be replicated across Canada. It is national funding. I will say that also this kind of work, while we get like some big funding to support these bigger sort of ambitious projects, a lot of this work is also happening in communities right now where they're actually actively activating their parks and public spaces. And a lot of it is about supporting existing community champions through things like, you know, the wonderful work that Park People does. So sitting right behind you is the executive director of Park People. They do wonderful work around supporting micro grants for people to activate their community park. So I think there's a lot of different strategies. One is like these demonstration projects. Another is just like facilitating and providing funding, even small amounts of funding and capacity building for communities that are already wanting to activate and do something simple in their park. It could be like hosting a knitting session or doing a walkabout. There's a lot of low cost opportunities in these communities. And proven models from nonprofits that are doing this work.
I could say for certain neighborhoods, like for example, Flemington Park and others, there's a lot of great potential in those neighborhoods. And when we started working with them, we worked with the National Film Board and interviewed people, and we found that people actually liked those neighborhoods a lot better than they were given the credit for. And we found that we were able to introduce something in the city called the RAC zoning, which is a new type of zoning. Worked very carefully with the zoning department. They love the idea of introducing a new zoning category because some of those neighborhoods, they could actually have up to 30 or 40,000 people living in the neighborhood. And it was all rental housing, all had to be rental housing. So you could take 30, 40,000 people. That's about the size of Port Hope. Ontario Port Hope has libraries, a council, parks, Main Street, all kinds of things. But none of that was permitted in these neighborhoods. And so, in fact, the idea about changing the zoning to sort of say you could do other things in this neighborhood was a really, I think, a big step forward to actually help provide the opportunity for people to do cooler and more interesting things.
Hi, good evening, panelists and fellow community members as well. Thank you so much for sharing, each and every one of you, from the slide presentation, but also the brilliant work that all your organizations have been doing to make our city a better place for all of us. I think I want to rewind our memory just a little bit back to when we had the idea of priority neighborhoods. And I like what Michael just said in regards to specific and different neighborhoods, as well as Eric, in regards to how we prioritize the cultural capital and value that these diverse communities bring to us. From Regent Park right back to Alexander Park, from Lawrence Heights right back to Villaways. And I think you talk about a film, Unarmed Verses, that was done by Charles Officer, is a brilliant film that was done about one of my communities in Villaways, and the way in which we had condos and TCHC living side by side. I think David Miller had the vision for how that can happen across our city in regards to how we have mixed income neighborhoods and making these neighborhoods a priority for us at our city hall. And I really wish that we can bring that sentiment back, because I think communities felt wanted, they felt seen, they felt heard, and they also felt that even though we're going through the process of gentrification, revitalization, their stake in our community and in our city was still being valued. And I really want us to really reimagine how we can actualize what Eric was talking about in regards to communities that do have mixed diversity blended into the fabric of how we build these communities. Because it's not only the slogan of diversity is our strength, but it's rather the idea of how do we live together to create a more fair society for each and every one of us to flourish. I think that's really the vision. If that is the vision, then we have to look at how our actions is going to change the results for that. The second point is regards to traffic and the idea of congestion. I think, Mr. Eric was trying to create zoning within New York and charging people to come into the city. We had conversations in regards to that back when David Miller was mayor, in regards to how can we make sure that traffic congestion in the city gets reduced. That's how you had King Street only having the actual streetcar and no traffic at all. That's how that conversation came about into action. So I'm curious to know, where are we now around the idea of actually having some kind of a fee to enter the city if you choose, because it is a choice you're making, to drive into the city. We have the green line and the yellow line, and they run really, really well to bring you in and out of the city. And so I think we need to start looking at how that will affect our environmental footprint, what it means for us to have a cleaner city, and also a city that's less congested, less noisy, and one that is pedestrian friendly and community friendly.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I'm not sure I know what the question is. But I think the conversation on a lot of I think people for a long period of time, particularly in like the suburban expansion, started to undervalue their city centers. This was broadly true of all of North America, not just Toronto. And then we ended up planning around this sort of like endless suburban expansion. And there wasn't as much pressure to live in the city. And now what we're seeing is like, actually, it's like the opposite. It's like the return to urbanism, because people want more community, they want more access, and they don't want to live by the car. To the extent that those conversations are occurring in Ontario, I do think there's a lot of popularity secretly behind things like congestion charges. Like, I personally think that they're inevitable. It's like, is it a 5-year inevitability? Is it a 15-year inevitability? I think that's essentially true. But I think what's more important, like on the diversity point that you're making, is that we kind of have to allow for things to occur. And so when we talk about like land use change and rezoning and things like that, it's actually about making space for other creative people to think about how we might use land. So by reducing barriers, a not-for-profit might identify a space working with the church, turn a parking lot into like a mixed income community, right? But if we don't create the actual space for that to be easy to do, then it's not going to happen. So to the extent that we want more diversity in our city, we need to allow for things to occur without planning for it. So planning without planning in some ways. Thanks.
And I got to pick up on some of your earlier points as well, because as you were talking, one of sort of the things that kind of came to mind, which is sort of a principle that I've always thought was quite important, and it's there's an American urbanist named he's Peter Kageyama, and he wrote this book called For the Love of Cities, and he talked about the principle of co-creation. And the way you create cities is you co-create them between the bureaucrats and the politicians and the artists and the entrepreneurs and the advocates and the architects and you've got to kind of approach city building as this like collaborative co-creation process if it's truly going to be successful. And I think that's kind of picking up on what you're saying. And as sort of a planner, the best sort of definition I've ever heard of what is planning is that, what's the role of planning? Is, as planners, and the role of planning is you build a stage on which others perform. And I've always liked that because it is both powerful and humble. It is kind of speaking a little bit to where you're going, is you can't dictate that people go out into the park and have fun because I've planned it there and we put a playground and you must now go and have fun in that playground. It doesn't work that way. But as a planner, you can create the opportunity and then let kind of people make it what they need it to be.
I have good news for you. There's the priority neighborhood work continues. United Way of Greater Toronto they have a strong neighborhood strategy. I encourage you to check it out. It's some really great work, basically focused on creating those environments for collective agency, where a lot of different community partners are at the table, as well as their power to sort of convene city stakeholders. And so I think that's a great resource. And then on the congestion charge, let's bring it on. Let's have the debate. There's been a lot of, at least I think, some questions and some articles and opinions, but I'm all here for continuing to open up that conversation. We have a counselor here that might be able to even also broach the subject. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
I'm happy to comment. I mean, those are things that we've talked about and we've actually engaged the province on, and they have clearly said no. We also said to the province too, we'd like to put a toll on the Gardner DVP, and they've said no. So it's not lack of trying on city council in trying to actually address congestions in those ways, but the province has pushed back, and not only this government, but the previous government as well, to be fair. So, but the conversation continues. When it comes to cultural districts, we do have a plan at the city. We have a master plan we're looking at right now. It started with looking at Little Jamaica, and also I've asked the team to look at the Church Wellesley neighborhood community to allow that to be a cultural district as well. I know there's some communities in Scarborough that they're also looking at. So it is in the works. It's a priority for me as a local councillor for this board, and it will happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, I'm on a couple of committees. We've looked at why things are the way they are. Rental housing. The rent is the rate at which everything else is established, and the government removed legislation that controlled rent. As a result, all the prices have gone up. I was at a meeting some time ago with two city planners ago, asked a question that caused some ruckus in the meeting. And my question was, and I'll ask it again, does city planning plan the city, or do the developers plan the city? Because what I've seen with the Science Center and the Ontario Place and the Ontario line is that was built so developers could tear down the Science Center, put condos there, and then have a traffic flow of the people in those condos down to the center of the city. That's what it looks like to me. And I look at this neighborhood, and it's condo, condo, condo. Church Wellesley Neighborhood Association I'm part of, we fought condo after condo after condo. It doesn't make any difference. They just put them up. So government needs to be there to actually regulate and legislate and get things done. Chris, I'd like to thank your staff for putting together this tremendous panel and this opportunity. I really wish somebody would look at Parliament Street, the 4 women shelter townhouse complex.
10 years, still not finished. No project supervisor. Why did it take 10 years to finish the lovely new North Market? Why does everything take so long?
I'll start with the sort of, the planning part, because it is something that I often hear a lot. It's frankly one of the reasons why I wanted to put that one slide in the presentation, to understand kind of where municipal planning fits, because I think there is a general perception that, planning doesn't plan, planning kind of dictates and makes all the final decisions at where everything goes. And that's actually not the way our planning system is structured in Ontario. It is something that is practiced under the purview of planning legislation, provincial planning legislation, and quite frankly, that provincial planning legislation has narrowed the scope of what latitude municipalities have to plan. I will say some of it good. There was a time when each municipality could individually choose whether or not you wanted in your city to allow people to put a basement apartment into their home. These kinds of things are now like provincial minimums that you actually have to apply. So some of that has, I think, been beneficial. But yeah, there's a narrowed scope there of what the role of municipal planning is. That's not to say there's not an important role, and I think that's an important thing to emphasize. There is a lot of good work that happens in the interplay between municipal planning and neighborhoods and developers, and it can actually lead to really good outcomes. But all of that is practiced within a limited scope of jurisdiction set by the province, and always the appealability of any local decision to a provincial tribunal kind of looms over everything that happens at the local level.
Yeah, so, I'm not going to address like the specific, eruption that starts with the C that we see from the province on some of these things. But I think what's important to consider as a citizen is, what are the systems that we have in place, and what type of incentives did they create for the players who are involved in those systems? And to an extent that, say a big developer who can go to the housing minister and say, can you grant me an MZO so I can go build this thing near a transit station and circumvent the process? Like, why was it necessary for that big developer to go and circumvent the process? Did they not think that there was fair consideration or what have you? So to me, what's important in how we think about policy is, well, does our system create pathways for this type of behavior that results, and I'd say, an unfair practice of the system? And I think people say, well, what we need to do is have more regulation. Whereas what I would probably say is, what we probably need to do is have clearer rights for everyone, an easier way for most projects to get to yes. And therefore, the incentive of anyone who wants to build anything isn't to go to their elected official and get granted an exception because they know that the process is going to treat them evenly and fairly within a reasonable amount of time. And so what's important on all these things is that the systems don't create outlets where forms of corruption can be advantageous, and that it makes sense to go by the rules and processes that we put in place.
Hi. My question's for the panel. I'm not sure if my numbers are correct, but maybe you guys can correct it. In 2015, we had a homelessness about 1,500 people. And I think recently, 24 or 23, it's about 12,000 homeless people. I'm wanting to hear from you folks if you can tell us what some of the causes of that homelessness has been. Has it been looked at? And is the city, as you're planning, working to ensure that whatever happened between 15 and 2024 is not going to happen, so that we're going to have maybe a doubling or a tripling of homelessness in the next 10, 15 years? Thank you.
I can talk about it if you want to go straight off of the
Again, housing is something that is a priority to this government, the local government. We spend about $2 billion a year on housing, so providing housing for people most marginalized in the city, if you include TCHC. And it continues. again, COVID has not helped either. People come into the city looking for various supports, be it withdrawal management support, addiction services support, mental health support. Historically, Toronto Center has provided 62% of social services support right here. And people come here for those reasons and they stay. I've actually worked really hard sitting in various boards across the province and the country, talking to various stakeholders about that. We know that people actually, heal faster and better if they actually stay within their communities, where their families are at, where their doctors are at. Another compounding factor is been the refugee influx into the city. And so one of the reasons why we've actually had a lot of encampments over the last couple of years is because a lot of refugees actually have been in the shelter system. 52% of people in the shelter systems are refugees, which means that the people that are in the parks, we haven't been able to move into shelter. There has been a bit of a backlog. And so we have intentionally worked with the federal and the province to try to find more housing, supportive housing for people who are coming here. So you'll see that the trend is changing. But again, I think, it cannot be just a Toronto resolution. It has to be really a provincial and federal resolution. So again, we're doing that, as a city, and the mayor and council is really advocating very strongly. Housing is complex, right? So it's a human right, and everyone should be housed. And we're a wealthy country, despite what people may think. There's enough resources to go around, but we are building as quickly as we can. And I do have to say this after 8 o'clock, so I'm just going to allow the panelists to have a final thoughts before I close things off.
Chris, I was just going to follow up with that to sort of say, I think when we talk about communities, those include homeless people. They include people who need housing and need care and attention. And I think we also need to recognize that it's a international problem. And it's not something we can look to the local councillor and say, why aren't you solving this problem for us? Because it's a much broader problem than that. So I think you're doing a great job, by the way, just so you know.
So I think the homelessness question is a great one. And my opinion on homelessness is it is really a housing problem first. If you look at like West Virginia and Tennessee, those are the two states with the highest rates of reported mental health and drug addiction challenges. The top states for homelessness are New York and California. And so to the extent that expensive housing creates a very high first rung of the ladder and a very hard fall off of that ladder, I think it's really worthwhile to say that. The second piece is, if you actually look at data in Ontario, in Toronto in particular, about 10% of all hospital beds are occupied by people who do not have stable addresses to discharge them to. And if you look at the actual operational cost of that, it's about $20,000 a month versus having someone in a shelter is about $3,000 a month. So to the extent that the province can actually afford the upfront capital cost and actually reduce its health costs, build more shelters and transitional housing, the economic case for it is quite clear. One of the biggest challenges in getting all these spaces built is actually the pushback from neighborhoods in which they're proposed. And so there is something that we need to do socially in order to accept that we need these places in order to help the people who have fallen off that really high first rung. And I do think that has to be dealt with at the provincial and federal level in partnership with the city. And then I guess just to wrap this up, thank you for having me on this panel. I like to talk, and thank you guys all for coming.
I'll keep it quick. Just again, thank you. I think that Torontonians' love language is criticism, and I'm here for it. So just know that everybody here who is like being critical, including you all, this is how we express love in Toronto, which is like the best city in the world, in my opinion. So just wanted to celebrate that.
No, I already said thank you very much. So I'm honored to be here tonight. It was a really good conversation, and I've learned so much from my fellow panelists. Thank
I'll repeat what I said earlier this was my first public remarks since taking on this job a couple months ago. So thank you to the panel for being kind and to the audience for being kind and not asking me like super specific questions like what does policy 3.4 of the zoning bylaw mean? Because I wouldn't have known the answer. So thank you, and thank you for the invitation, Councillor.
Yes. Thank you, Eric, Amanda, Michael, and Jason. They were incredible. Thank you so much. I was told I have some closing remarks somewhere there. It was actually, I learned a lot. Thank you so much. It was a really great great event. Where's my binder? It's over there. It's over there. We do have some upcoming events. I would like to share that with all of you. Thank you, Sherwin. You're amazing. So please join us at our next TC Talks. The next one will be on June 10th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Wellesley Community Center, just down the street. We will be discussing the important topic of tenant rights. For the talk, we will be inviting Rent Safety O, Neighborhood Legal Services, and other community organizations that represent tenant advocacy. And I'm missing my handy stand. I'm good. Other fun events. Thank you very much, Edward. We have in the community on Saturday, May 17th and Saturday, July 19th, we have our annual environmental day. So bring your old homework and old documents for shredding. Bring any chemical waste like old paint, dead batteries, or broken electronics for recycling. Bring a bucket for a bag of garden soil because we will be giving out compost. For Allen Gardens, we have loose soil. For Regent Park, we have bagged soil. If you have a yard, we will also be giving out trees. Supplies are limited, so be there early. So see you there. Are the trees coming from you? Okay. Well, really, it's from all. Oh, the city's bringing 100 trees. Oh, that's good. Pardon? Forestry and Urban Services. Okay, wonderful. Again, thank you to all of you. And again, my constitute office is at 329 Parliament Street. You could call my office. You could visit my office. You could email my office. I always say this, I do not respond to social media posts. We only post on it. Because again, that's where people go and die. Anyways, again, thank you so much for coming out. I really enjoyed having all of you here. A lot of work actually goes into this. It doesn't happen organically. I just want to thank my entire team who's here around the room. I think half of them are here today. Macy, Sherwin, Tyler, Stanley's back there, Edward, Mary somewhere around there somewhere. Well, and two of our students who started today. Oh my God, I forgot their names. Francesca and Jenny, they're with us for a few months. So we have a great team. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Linda is also our Black Fellow. Is she here? Here's Linda. I didn't forget you. So we have a wonderful team at City Hall who work on your behalf every single day. So it does take a village. And have a safe journey home. Thank you.